moving on to some different news, Waymo has hit parity with Lyft.
I feel like what's so crazy about being in San Francisco is you're like, you see these cars and you're like, this is happening. And the rest of the world is like, can self-driving happen?
Yeah, when you're in San Francisco, and at least for a while when you've been, because you got the early invite code, so you've known it for a while, but it's around, it's happening. And at this point, it is just the norm. At this, like it's surpassed one of the largest rideshare companies.
In classic human emotional processing of new technology, we have already moved past, oh my God, there's self-driving cars, to, I don't know, there are going to be a lot of problems. And you've been talking to some of the Uber crew, the people who are used to human.
We're too negative, but
no, yeah, I'm just laughing. But
that's the reporter angle, right? Yeah, we always have to see what could go wrong. But
so what could go wrong?
I've been talking to some of the Uber people who've had a little bit of concerns from their own experience scaling Uber in different cities and communities that know this firsthand, that there's things that come in when you grow like this. You have, the mass adoption of riderships, you hit that pivotal moment, but one thing that you need to look out for always is the human element. I mean, there's been an increase of reports of Waymos getting trashed. Obviously, there was Waymos being set on fire in different parts of San Francisco before, but just in general, cleanliness is an issue. If there's not a driver in the car to maintain it, how do you monitor for that? Pro-social behavior. So that's just one factor.
Waymo's becoming the ultimate teenage hookup spot and drug.
As a completely private chauffeur, that's like, oh my gosh.
People dreamed about it. It's like, oh, you can have an office, going when you're on a long drive, you have your own private car. But of course, there are lots of other things people might want sort of on-demand private space for. I mean, I think one thing that's interesting about the Uber people's observations is just, Uber obviously has important technology, but in some ways the company succeeded with operational excellence. That meant dealing with regulators, but it also meant figuring out where the cars could park and what zones people could go into and how they should handle sports, like the baseball game ending and everything in between. And so I think the message here is, okay, you figured out San Francisco in sort of neat little zones when you were only letting the elites on who are very studious about and very,
and just
sort
excited.
I feel like
Waymo.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
you
it's
let the
people on your
fanboys
team. And so now the next step is when you open it up even wider, there's lots of new factors that you have to control for or not control for and figure out a way to deal with. In conversations with some people adjacent to the Uber world, one thing I found interesting was how the Waymo fleets that are, launching in Austin and Atlanta later this year are really partnering with Uber. Uber is pretty much controlling the infrastructure for that. And so I wonder if we'll see, more of these partnerships out of necessity crop up, at least in the near future, as self-driving moves to different cities.
That's clearly the story Uber wants. I mean, they want Waymo to be like, oh my God, this is going to be such a headache. Let's hand this over. I think, Waymo is in the power position. They've got the technology so they can say, all right, in this city, we'll do it. In this city, you do it. And let's see if you're really so much better. So I think that will be an interesting experiment to run. I mean, my question for you is, how much do you think this is all going to slow down the deployment? Because I think the real question is, how much of the work that Waymo did in San Francisco is specific to understanding the streets of San Francisco versus they now have a playbook to roll out in other cities? I mean, do you have a point of view on that?
That's a good point. San Francisco has a pretty unique setup, right? It's dense, it's narrow. There's not as many, factors of constant jaywalking in the degree that you experience in a mega city like New York, And I think that they'll need to maybe take a play-by-play city by city approach as they go forward. Obviously, Western cities involve a lot more highway driving. Self-driving around cities is one of the hardest hurdles to get across. And if you're in other urban environments, especially in suburban ones, with these self-driving trucking companies that are popping up for highway driving, that'll be a host of different problems, but presumably more controllable factors than sort of all of the abnormal edge cases that you have to account for in city driving.
As someone who used to be like, oh, self-driving cars are way overhyped, I think these are small speed bumps relative to developing the technology. I mean, first of all...
Oh, you're bullish. Okay. You've done you've jumped. You've done 180.
I'm totally bullish. I've been bullish on self-driving at this point. I mean, I was bearish, I don't know, 5 years ago, but when Uber was doing it, I was extremely bearish because I saw how many interventions they had. Once I was in Waymo without a driver, I became extremely bullish. But my point is just that they can restrict who gets on the network, to worry about the quality. You can penalize people. I mean, they have cameras looking in the cars. They're going to know exactly what happened. They can use AI. To me, the pro Uber Lyft case that I believe the most is the sort of liquidity of the network, or this issue of when you actually have to pay for what Waymos cost. And that's what we don't really know. Will it make sense to have Waymos at the density that you need so that you're ready for rush hour traffic versus right now, Waymo can sort of be, we're there when we're available. And if not, you'll take an Uber. You know what I mean? They're sort of not a service that can exist just like to meet the flexible demand. Uber and Lyft's innovation was that they incentivized drivers to work when there was a lot of work to be done and not when there wasn't. And Waymo doesn't have the same mechanism besides just, parking the car.
Yeah. Right now, Waymo is also top down too. Part of the Uber and Lyft mechanism is that it's the driver's car, right? And so that's another level of overhead that some people that I've spoken to have said can be really difficult with scaling going forward, that you might need to find a way to handle that that's not fully controlled by the company also manufacturing the self-driving software.
Yes. A recurring theme is always, if you give something away for less than it costs you to produce, that will be a very popular product. And then once you have to get the margins right, who knows how things will sort out. And so how much is Waymo heavily subsidizing this to make it work? And can they find a model where they can deliver it competitively? If they can't, they're going to, it's going to struggle.
Well, traditional transportation companies also typically have, razor thin margins as is. Like it's a tough model.
Waymo is such a superior product to driving. Like that, to me, is the case. They also have the leverage. They can decide, do we work with automakers or do we do it ourselves? Do we work with Uber or do we do it ourselves? Like, I would much rather be in the Waymo position. And I just think fundamentally, the other piece of it is that if it's a network, they get to coordinate all their cars together and sort of learn things from each other, versus if all their, the car companies are doing their own technology. Anyway, I think Waymo remains in a super strong position. People counted Google out forever, and this thing in a decade is going to be like transformative. And I think it's a question of when the first city says we only want self-driving cars, no more of these crazy human drivers. Do you agree, disagree? I mean, that's you're from Texas. Aren't you? Yeah. You don't have a little bit of real American, we're never going to get rid of cars. It's like guns,
No, I mean, I feel like it's the, I have to speak to my Texan roots. There's some individual myth of, being the man behind the wheel, if you will, that I think is going to be hard to give up in my counterpoint to you. Nothing rational, entirely vibes, but
that's what Texas is for. The guns and cars can be in Texas, and the dense metropolitan areas will have no human drivers and hopefully no guns.
But what do you do when there's a city in Texas where the Waymos are?
Yeah.
We'll find out.
That's the American experiment.
Yeah. But anyway, very exciting. It's exciting news. I think, as someone who's really excited about self-driving, like to see them hit this critical mass in San Francisco. And they're expanding into more cities. So we'll have this experiment play out again and again.